Welcome to our live virtual event with Judith Heumann. I'm Mark Koplik of the New York State Writers Institute here at the University at Albany. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for today's events, UAlbany's Disability Access and Inclusion Student Services, DAIS, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. This conversation will be hosted by our friend, James Odato. Jim is one of the great investigative journalists here in upstate New York. He's the newly named editor of Adirondack Explorer and the author of an acclaimed new book about disability rights activist Lucy Gwin, titled This Brain Had a Mouth, Lucy Gwin and the Voice of Disability Nation. Judith Heumann is a truly historic figure among the hundreds, the thousands who have worked hard for the disability rights movement. She's one of the bravest warriors in that revolution. Judy speaks truth to power from a wheelchair. Over the course of half a century, she served as one of the principal organizers of many campaigns, protests, and sit-ins that have culminated in landmark legislation to protect the rights of the disabled. She's held office in 2 presidential administrations. She's a star of the Oscar-nominated 2020 documentary Crip, A Disability Revolution, and the author of 2 new memoirs, Being Human, and the YA autobiography, Rolling Warrior, the incredible, sometimes awkward, true story of a rebel girl on wheels who helped spark a revolution. They're available for purchase from the Bookhouse via a link on your screen. You can read more about her accomplishments here on this page. Her books are currently being adapted as a biopic film by Sean Hayter, the Oscar-nominated director of the film Coda, currently up for an Academy Award. Please welcome the incredible Judy Heumann. Take it away.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, Jim.
Thank you for coming tonight. For the people who are watching this webinar, I often think about how if you got into your car and drove to the local mall and asked 100 people to come up with a name of 1 or 2 or any disability rights leader before the ADA was enacted and after, 1 name, could you come up with 1 name? Well, as a result of tonight, you're going to be able to come up with at least 1 name. And if you read Judy Heumann's book, The Unrepentant Memoir of a Disability Rights Activist, you would be able to name many people, because she sprinkles the names liberally in her memoir, because she met with them, she worked with them, and she fought with them. Judy, thank you for coming tonight.
Very nice to be here.
We have a good group to listen to you talk about your work and your activism. One of the things I have to ask right off the bat, because of where I come from, is when you look back at the many years from when you were in your early 20s and to date, looking at how the disability rights movement was covered by mainstream journalists, I'm wondering if you could give me your evaluation, your assessment as to how mainstream has covered the movement.
It's a great question. And I would say this is an area where there has been change. Today, many newspapers and magazines and other forms of news media are doing a better job. That's not to say they're doing a great job, but they're doing a better job than they certainly did in the 60s, 70s. Started a little bit more in the 80s, 90s and forward. But I think as the disability rights movement has gained strength, particularly, local newspapers maybe playing an important role if there are disability rights organizations in those communities that are working with local media. I remember in the 1970s, I was in Brooklyn, New York, and had been involved with helping to set up a group called Disabled in Action. And we had a demonstration outside the New York Times because they were failing to cover disability in anything except the medical section and the socialite sections. And we wanted it to be covered in the same sections as civil rights and women's rights issues. So I think papers like the New York Times in the last number of years have really been doing a much better job on addressing disability. They have someone on staff who works on disability. They have regular articles that are being written by disabled individuals. And I think they're really an example of what we would like to see happening. Also, I think, there are more disabled journalists, although disabled journalists will definitely be speaking about how they don't get the same opportunities as non-disabled journalists. But there is an organization being formed of disabled journalists, which I think is also important. The bottom line in, we've had a little bit of improvement, but it's not yet where we need to be at all.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that you got your start as a disability rights activist, partly because of a New York Times article about your situation trying to become a teacher.
Yes. So that's an interesting story. I knew someone who was a disabled journalism major at Long Island University, and he was doing some work with the New York Times. And I believe Malcolm Davis was the gentleman's name who wrote the first piece, documenting the fact that I'd been denied my right to teach. I had passed my oral, I had passed my written, but I was failed on my medical because of, quote, paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis. So when Malcolm did the article the next day, I didn't know about the article was going to be coming out. The next day, the New York Times did an editorial, and then the Daily News and the New York Post also did editorials, and I was on the Today Show. And so that particular issue really did pick up. And we did have stories for a year in magazines like Good Housekeeping and others. So that was an important little bump in the road. Then we had things like during the 504 demonstrations in San Francisco. So for our audience, there is a provision of law called Section 504. It was passed as a part of a bigger bill in 1973. And it prohibits discrimination against disabled people in programs receiving money from the federal government. Between 73 and 77, the regulations or rules explaining how the law was to be implemented were developed, but they weren't signed. And so there were demonstrations around the United States. There was coverage in the Bay Area where I had moved from New York to the Bay Area. There was a reasonable amount of coverage in the Bay Area because the disability community had been involved in an inclusive way with other groups, labor unions, women's groups, anti-war groups, etc. And so we were getting coverage. And then there was a wonderful reporter from ABC. And when a group of us went from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. as a part of the 504 demonstrations, he came with us. And so there was some very important footage, although there was a strike then, and footage was lost. But nonetheless, I think you could see there, when you look at this film called Crip Camp, that there was footage of various activities going on around Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that was because the media was beginning slowly to recognize certain issues.
Yeah, we already have some questions coming in. I'll get right to a couple of them. there's a woman named Cecilia who's asking, what's the best way to bring light to human rights violations during natural disasters and war times and their effects on disabled communities?
I think, I was looking at the question.
Yeah.
There are a number of organizations that are specifically looking at the issue of disaster preparedness, as well as government agencies. So there's a group in California called the World Institute on Disability, which has been doing a lot of work in the area of disaster preparedness, and then also interventions working with various organizations and development organizations and aid organizations in the US and in other countries to address these issues. There's a partnership program in Philadelphia that also is doing a lot of work in this area. And then internationally, there are various organizations, including groups like Humanity and Inclusion, which do work in the area of disaster preparedness, and significantly they're going in and working in communities that have experienced various disasters, including from war and earthquakes. So again, it's what you see over the last 30, 50 years is an increase in attention being paid in areas that hadn't been addressed previously. And the issue of disaster is definitely one that's been being worked on much more in earnest since like 2007, 2008 with Katrina. But I also want to say that one of the intended outcomes of the work that these groups are doing is to get organizations like the American Red Cross and Red Cross International to really be including disability in preparedness work, so that if there is a disaster or when there is a disaster, things like shelters are accessible and other accommodations are being made. The federal government also, through FEMA, FEMA also has a program there where they have focused on the issue of disaster preparedness and relief inclusive of disability. And they've been doing that now for about 12, 15 years. Again, not enough, but more.
Now, in your book, you use some key scenes to describe ways you were ignored, oppressed, and disrespected that were memorable, to say the least, compelling. When you chose the events in your life to include in your book, how did you go about making those choices? Why those scenes? Why those particular moments in your life?
So I worked on this book with a woman named Kristen Joyner, who I have to say there would have been no book without Kristen. She's a great writer, and it was a great experience for me to work with someone who was a really good writer, and to learn how to work together, to do such things, Jim, as decide which stories we were going to tell, because obviously I have many more stories. I wanted to move in the direction where the stories would be relating to different parts of my life that were also not uncommon to anyone. So, growing up and issues when you went to school, and experiences that you had growing up and beginning to think about what you wanted to do when you were getting older, on and on. But obviously for me, and millions of other disabled people, our stories in many cases were different because of discrimination, because of lack of accessibility. And I think it's an important way for people to learn, to be able to really delve more deeply into what individual people's experiences are. and one individual's experience is not identical to another individual's experience. But I think what we've tried to do also in the book is, because I am an extrovert and I naturally do work with other people, I think you get that flavor throughout the book.
Yes.
That my whole life, it's like no one person ever, makes huge changes. It's the ability to work effectively with other people who are like you and not like you, but can share a similar and common vision. So that's how we were selecting stories, things that I felt other people had liked, or when I'd spoken about them, children or adults, parents of disabled kids, just general population would be saying things like, I didn't know that, I didn't understand that. And the books plus the film, Crip Camp, I think it's that common theme of why didn't we know these stories? And because they weren't being told, because the media wasn't telling them, the press wasn't reporting them. And so I believe my books and many other people's books and film Crip Camp and other films and things like Coda, Child of a Deaf Adult, moving forward, hopefully to get an Academy Award this Sunday, and Crip Camp and many others, is a way for people to begin not only to learn by reading and looking, but also hopefully by looking in your neighborhood, in your, where you work, where you shop, asking the question of how is disability being discussed? And I think, one of the big issues in disability is that, close the door, honey. That, close the door, please. This is my friend who's coming in. There are many people with disabilities who have invisible disabilities. And so it's important to be authentically telling the story so that people get an understanding of the breadth of the population. In the US, we talk about around 60 million disabled people. Many of those people may have depression or anxiety or bipolar or lupus or cancer or severe back problems or ALS or MS or Parkinson's or deafness, hard of hearing, blindness, low vision, on and on and on and on. And we don't need to know everyone's individual story, but we need, I think, to understand that our goals and aspirations are similar to others. We need to understand why people's goals and aspirations are not necessarily coming to fruition. There could be many reasons, but in disability, some of those reasons are based on lack of opportunities, discrimination, societies that still aren't built the right way.
Mhm. Besides being described as a natural extrovert, you've been described as, in your book, as a matter of fact, people refer to you as calmly unstoppable, badass. You describe your mother as having this beautiful smile, but people didn't realize the steel underneath that she could blindside you with. And you also talked about being tearful and terrified at moments and having to swallow some of that or put it aside to stand up for what you were believing in. I'm wondering if you can describe what characteristics you did take from your parents. Your parents were German Jews who left Germany in the 30s, escaping the Holocaust themselves, but certainly being impacted by the Holocaust. I wonder if you could talk about the characteristics that your parents, that you see in yourself from your parents.
Yeah, and I think, my mother lost her mother, her father, her aunt and family members, and many others. And my father lost his mother and father and other family members. So, they were sent out of Germany when they were 12 and 14 years old. So I would say that one thing they both had was resilience. My father was in the Marines. He fought in the Pacific. And, my mother was really hoping that her parents were going to come from Germany. They didn't know till later in the 40s that they'd been killed. So I think resilient is one word. My father pretty much talked about how there was no such thing as no, that you had to figure out how to do things. It didn't mean that it necessarily was a yes right away, but was really being persistent. So resilient, persistent, friendly. My dad had a butcher store with his brother. He was friendly with people. My mother was too, but my father and I on that level, I think, were more, because he had a small store, he had to make talk with people who were coming in and out. And, he would walk the dog and talk to people in the neighborhood. And yeah, my mother was on various committees and organizations. So in their own way, they knew a lot of people. And, they learned something that they weren't prepared to learn. And that was having a child with a disability then meant that their vision of what they wanted me to be able to do was not going to happen as naturally as it would for my brothers. And that if they didn't play an active role in what was going to happen for me, and they allowed, the pathway or lack of a pathway that was being put forth, by the city, by the state, by boards of education, et cetera, that I would not have been able to get a decent education and be able, I think, to be in a position where in some way I was continuing to do the work that my mother and father had been doing for me. But my mother was also involved with a lot of community organizations, not dealing with disability per se, but the redlining that was going on in our neighborhood. And she was on a hospital community board. And so she also had lots of interests. So I think that's really, and the importance of family and maintaining good relations with people. My mother, I have a little funny story.
Go ahead.
So when I was working in the Clinton administration, I was up on the quote unquote hill, which meant I was going to a meeting on the House side. And at that point, Senator Schumer, then Congressman Schumer, was in the same hallway. And I went over to him and he was like, I'm really busy. And I said, I work in the Clinton administration. I want to thank you for your position on guns and gun violence. And thank you, but so he turns one way, I turn the other way. And we're going down the hallway and the guy is brilliant on names. Yeah. And he says, he turns around and he says, do you know Ilsa Heumann?
Yes.
And I said, she's my mother. She had passed away. She's my mother, was my mother. And he said, great woman. Now, what is interesting about that is we belong to a very small German Jewish synagogue. I mean, small, like a couple hundred people. And whenever they had various events, my mother would make sure to invite the local elected representatives. So he knew my mother through that. And the fact that he remembered that and made that comment made me very happy, obviously.
That's great. Look at that. I started my remarks talking about if people went to the mall and asked 100 people for the names of any disability rights leader, there might be a lot of no. I can't come up with ones. Do you think there's a hole in American history that's taught in public schools relative to the movement?
I mean, I wouldn't say there's a hole. I'd say there's nothing. So it's like, yeah, I mean, slowly we're seeing a little bit more appearing in what's being taught in schools around the country. A few states, I don't think New York has done this, but I believe California and one or two other states have gotten legislation passed which requires that disability be included in, this may not be completely right, but like in social studies during the course of the year. So it's slowly moving forward. I would say depending on your generation, you know, so my mother's generation, if asked that question, they may well have said Franklin Roosevelt, because while it wasn't really public that he had polio, a lot of people nonetheless knew that he had polio. And I think, but as a rule, people don't really know who some of the leaders were, like in New York and other states.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think some of that is changing a little bit, but it's so slow.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to say that movies like Crip Camp and my books and other books, when they're getting into the hands of younger people, they are really asking the question, why didn't we know this story and why aren't we being taught this? So I think over the next number of years, also with things like this and disability studies curricula that are increasing on university campuses, in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we will see more people being able to answer that question.
There's a young woman, I presume, named Paige, who has this question. She says, hello, so honored to be here. My question is, for young disabled people who want to get into activism and advocacy, where do you suggest we start?
I think you look for organizations that exist in your community. And I believe that David mentioned an organization at the university, which might be able to be helpful. But in like Albany, there's an organization called the Center for Independent Living of the Hudson Valley. I would suggest they would be, for those of you who live in that area, they would be a good organization to reach out to. And then also, depending on your disability, there are many different kinds of organizations that relate to certain types of disabilities, and they could also be helpful. If you're at the university, I think it's really talking to other disabled students. And likewise, if you're in high school, you could do that. But or the yellow pages, go online, look at social media. Yeah.
Good. Wow, geez.
There are organizations also, some national groups. One of them is the American Coalition, I'm sorry, American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD. They're another group that could help.
Good. You know, here's another question, Judy. Everybody's saying thank you for being here, but here's a question. I am disabled and part of a student group dedicated to activism for the disabled community at UAlbany. And one of our goals is making campus overall more accessible. Given your experience, is there any advice you have for those who also wish to be advocates for disability rights and education, even when it seems like progress has come to a standstill?
Well, I would look to see if there's a disability services office on your campus. And they should be able to help you reach out to some of the disability activists on campus. Looking at the issue of accessibility, I think is really important. I think it's important to find out whether there is a group of you that is concerned about this. I would ask for a meeting with the head of the university and with their planning department. If you're talking about physical accessibility, for example, and learning from them, what do they know about the issue of accessibility on campus? What are their plans to be making renovations? to remove those barriers, making sure that this is something which is put on the agenda of the leadership and in the right program. So look at, some places there have been plans in place. The bottom line is every university in the United States has had an obligation since 1973 to be addressing these issues. And too many universities have not yet done what they've needed to do, which means they haven't been doing appropriate planning. That any new building, any major renovation of a building should have been done appropriately, and other kinds of changes may need to be made in order to ensure that students and faculty and staff are really able to fully participate in life at the university.
Mhm. One of your scenes, there's a question that just came up. One of your scenes from your book was that that scene in the airplane when they were forcing you off the airplane.
Yeah.
Well, here's a question. We found out today that the emergency evacuation of us from airplanes are a process of the mid-1970s. How do we get DOT and FAA and Access Board to create evacuation procedures for today's people with disabilities?
I don't know if you were on this call today that DOT had on the issue of travel for disabled people. Were you?
No,
They weren't.
I don't think this person was.
At any rate, this is an issue which is definitely being discussed right now. There's a working group that's been working on this issue with people from around the country. If you go to Paralyzed Veterans of America's website, there'll be information up there on what's going on in this issue. You can probably go to the Department of Transportation, the Federal Department of Transportation, and get information on travel and disability. And there's an organization called the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. And they have a staff person named Carol Tyson, who also is working on this issue. There are
Okay.
a lot of people working on it.
There was the call, or the writer was on the call, she says, and she found the responses inadequate.
Yeah, I mean, what PVA and these other groups are trying to do is to pass a new piece of legislation. And I think that's ultimately what DOT keeps saying, is that they don't have the authority to do certain things, or it's just taking ridiculously long. It's more than just the issue of evacuation in the case of an emergency. It's just basic safety, getting on and off an airplane. If you can't transfer and you need assistance to get on an aisle chair, the kinds of aisle chairs, the people who are assisting you, chairs not having appropriate seatbelts, on and on, stairwells that are not dealt with appropriately. It's a mess.
Yeah. Okay. So if you are living in a community and you don't believe that the municipality is living up to accessibility requirements or responsibilities, what should you do?
I think it's very important to belong to organizations and to look at organizations that are working on an issue like this. If there really isn't an organization that's working in an area like this, or you really don't feel they're doing a right job, then you need to find other people and work with them on it. But, and your personal experiences are very important. That's one of the reasons to get involved with organizations, or in some cases, start new organizations, or, working groups that can work with existing organizations. I think trying to find out what the history is of what has been going on in these communities is very important, because usually there are other people who've been working on this. So it's like learning so that you're not wasting time replicating. And remember that in many cases, what you're asking for is legally required. I'm not going to say it's always legally required, but you can live in a community where they have to comply with the federal or state law, but that's only the floor.
Mhm.
So what these laws are, they're floor, they're not the ceiling. And
Right.
so trying to exceed what a law or regulation may require is also something that there's no reason not to try to do.
You say in your book, it's a pretty cool quote. You say most things are possible when you assume problems can be solved. And I'm wondering if that's something you got from your parents.
I mean, I think definitely a part of it, for sure, because what I saw is they kept trying and trying and trying, like trying to get me into school. It took them like until I was 9 years old to get me into school, supporting work that we were doing on dealing with discrimination in education and transportation, on and on. So absolutely. But I also was learning from the civil rights movement, the women's movement, other movements where we were seeing that coming together, creating an agenda, having a plan, working collaboratively together, having many voices speaking in a more unified way. All of those things are very important in being able to advance.
There's a woman, or excuse me, an individual saying that it's his belief that a lot of disability activist groups are not actually run by people with disabilities. Do you view this as a problem? And I wonder if there is some issue here that you might want to reflect on.
I think it's very important that disability groups are run by disabled people, or at the very least, people who have strong experience and work effectively and are accepted within the disability community. So it may mean that they have a family member who has a disability, but really for certain organizations like Centers for Independent Living, I think it is really important that we do our very best to get disabled people to run these groups, because some of these local organizations, in part, having a strong disabled person running the organization also gives a positive message, both to the disability community and to the non-disability community and to governments and businesses, that disabled people are able to run effectively organizations that are really not just working on disability, but the ultimate objective is to be working on the inclusion of disabled people in society. And if you accept, which I think is important, that disability is a normal part of life, and that what we're needing to look at is, if you believe that disability is a normal part of life and that you and family and loved ones at one point in time will either have a temporary or permanent disability, then it's really essential to be supporting what many of the disability groups are trying to do, and not ignore it and not think, oh, this doesn't affect me, because it does affect you. It may not affect you today, but it may well affect you tomorrow or a week or a month later.
And by the way, I just want to set the record straight. That last question came from a she, her. And now an individual also from the home care community has an interesting question. This is it. All of my friends who are watching in New York want to know this. We are fighting for fair pay for home care workers. In most places, home care workers are earning minimum wage in the Medicaid home care programs we rely on for our independence. We know storytelling helps non-disabled people understand our struggles. Do you have advice for young storytellers who are new to advocacy?
Yes, I do. You need to be involved with organizations. You need to be working the president's Build Back Better legislation originally had $450 billion in it for home and community-based services, only for Medicaid eligible programs, but nonetheless. And now nothing, it hasn't even been passed. It went down to 140 billion, but it hasn't happened. So there really is a need to help ensure that the disability community itself gets behind important pieces of legislation like this. But I also want to say that this particular Build Back Better provision on home and community-based services is something that's very important. Then there are people like myself who live in a state where there isn't a Medicaid waiver, and the amount of money that we're spending on personal assistance is extraordinary. The basic premise that was being discussed of people needing appropriate wages and benefits, absolutely. Because when people are being paid appropriate wages and benefits, then you're going to find more people to do the work that we need done in order to be able to live integrated, productive lives.
Mhm. I wonder if you have in your own Hall of Fame elected leaders, either current or past, who have really embraced your issues and helped you in achieving some of the legislation and improvements and reforms you've been looking for.
I mean, clearly, if you look at, and this should not be just looked at a federal level, but, in New York State, in the Albany area, who are the members of your city council, county boards, state legislatures, and federal reps who you feel confident with, who you get to meet with, who your organizations get to meet with, where, you feel that when you approach them on legislation that's being considered or that you want them to consider, that, you have an ear, that people are willing to listen to you. These changes in many ways don't come about easy, it takes time. But I also think it's very important for us to really understand the legislative process. For some people to understand finance and budgeting, we need to continue to become specialists in many areas so that we can argue and work around when people are looking at saying no. We need to look at how we put in priorities. And in many cases with financing, there are priorities. And we need to be able to argue successfully for priorities that are not just our priorities. But when I worked in Berkeley with local community organizations, one thing was very important is that we work not just with disability organizations, but with other organizations in the city or county that were run by different groups that would service delivery, legal rights groups, and that we came together as a whole, being able to articulate that we needed adequate funding in order to be able to help ensure that people weren't falling through the cracks. Did we get the money that we always needed? Absolutely not, but we really did work together, and I think that was valuable in continuing to move forward, and also learning about each other's organizations. And for me, one of the objectives always was to get organizations that maybe previously were not serving disabled people in like a housing program or clinics or whatever, to really understand what they weren't doing, what more they needed to do, and how we could be helpful.
Is there a staffing crisis?
Yes.
How severe is it?
I mean, talk to people who need it. In my view, it's very severe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think also there are a lot of people in this country who are immigrants who would be very qualified to do this work, getting appropriate wages and benefits, who are not able to work in these systems because they don't have the appropriate documentation. And I think this is really a tragedy. We need to make sure that people who want to do this work and who are qualified to do this work and other jobs, obviously, are able to work and earn a wage and come out from the shadow. I think that's all very important. So yes, there is a crisis. Partly, I do believe this crisis could be reduced by allowing people, because many of the programs you're talking about, people are getting paid with government funding, and they have to be able to show, that they are able to work in the country. So I think we need to be, in addition to arguing for appropriate wages and benefits, we still don't have enough people to do the personal assistance services the way I believe we want it, consistently, not with a million different people coming in and out of our house. Where there's a system which is respectful for both the provider and the user.
Mhm. Can you just describe what some of the barriers that still exist are
For what?
for people with disabilities?
In
Barriers.
general.
In general, all categories,
And
employment.
I think I think,
Sure.
there are many different areas. One of them I would say that's very important is how many people with disabilities are still in the shadow of their disability. They're afraid to speak up about the fact that they may have depression or anxiety, or as a woman told me on Tuesday at a meeting that I was speaking at, when I was 10 years old, she said I had been diagnosed with a heart murmur. I never told my friends that I had a heart murmur. I had to go to the doctor on a regular basis, but I would always give them a different excuse about why I was leaving school. And this woman now is in her 20s or 30s, but I think that comment to me was very indicative of many people who are ashamed, are embarrassed, are fearful. So I would say that's something that's not legislative, that doesn't take money, that really takes our ability as a disability community to really allow other people to see that their voices count, and that their voices count as an insider as opposed to a spectator, if in fact they can be supportive of changes in budgets and laws and policies and practices. So that's really one of my strong beliefs. In addition to that, it's issues of enforcing law. I think for me, in the area of education, in primary, secondary school and universities, I think there's still not enough funding that's going in to ensure that our public schools are well-funded, have appropriately trained teachers, where the schools themselves are in good conditions, and where kids have the most updated technology and resources and books. I think that's critical to ensure that kids are not dropping out of school, they're not failing in school, and that teachers and administrators are getting the training they need, and also being held accountable for serving children as the law requires it.
Are the
Healthcare, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Healthcare. No, I'm just going to say that healthcare is still a major issue in this country. ACA, which celebrated its 12th anniversary, I believe, yesterday, is what some call the Obamacare or the American ACA. But I think Americans really, we complain about healthcare costs, as we should, but we don't know enough about other systems. And we've been fed a bill of goods that our healthcare system is the best in the world, that we don't have waiting lists and all these things, which is not true. We may have excellent healthcare for some people, but too many people are still without any health insurance. And too many people, even who have health insurance, have inadequate health insurance. And if you just look at COVID, and like 250,000 people at a minimum have died who had disabilities. In many cases, they were not getting the appropriate health care that they needed with diabetes or hypertension. They weren't getting diagnosed, they weren't getting medications, then when they got sick with COVID, their bodies succumbed because they were weak as a result of other disabilities, which in some cases they wouldn't have had if they had appropriate food and exercise and various things.
Yes. The Affordable Care Act was under,
Obama.
well, yeah, well, no, it was under, imperiled in recent history.
Yes.
Prior to, it was
Under the
under
Republic.
attack.
Well, the
Yeah.
Republicans did everything they could to kill and to
Yeah.
remove sections of the bill to make it basically ineffective. And I think in part, now I'm not blaming the American population for this, but what I am saying is we need to have a better understanding of what your life would look like if you lived in England, as an example, or what your life would look like if you lived in Canada, as far as if you got sick, what coverage you had, what you paid for, what you didn't pay for. I have a very good friend and her parents live in England, and her father was sick for a couple of years, and he was in and out of the hospital with doctor's home visits, etc. And they basically paid nothing out of pocket. They were very satisfied with the services and care that he got. And the National Health Service is something that is really revered and people fight for it. Here, we have people arguing against getting appropriate healthcare coverage, like elected representatives who get decent healthcare as a result of being an elected representative. And they're not about to give up their healthcare in order to go out and, put themselves on the market. Before things like pre-existing conditions were banned, I mean, I knew a guy, he had been head of a foundation. And when he left the foundation, he couldn't get healthcare because he had a pre-existing condition. So one of the important changes that Obamacare or the ACA resulted in was getting rid of pre-existing condition restrictions.
Mhm. Hi, Judy. Can you talk about doing international disability rights advocacy and the particular challenges and opportunities you had as part of the State Department?
So both at the Department of Ed and when I worked with the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, I started doing international work really in the 70s. Then when I started working with government and the World Bank in education and State Department, my opportunities were part of my job. So the ability to travel to other countries and work either with World Bank offices or with embassies to both help them understand and meet people from the disability community, to learn about the issues that people were facing, to be able to get groups like the World Bank and the State Department and USAID and other groups to really understand the conditions that many disabled people are living in particularly poorer countries, but also even in middle income countries where laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act are much stronger than laws that exist in many countries. I think one of the important parts about what's been going on internationally is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And if you're interested in international work, there's an organization called IDA, the International Disability Alliance, and they've got a great website and will allow you to learn more about work that they're doing. And they represent, or they are an umbrella of more than 13 international disability rights organizations, as well as regional organizations.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You've had a lot of jobs. Starting out as a teacher and then working with Ed Roberts with the Center for Independent Living, the first Center for Independent Living, and all these jobs you were inside and you were outside. You were an activist on the street.
Always an activist.
Yeah, but you were on the street and then you were in the office, in government, etc.
Inviting people from the street inside.
There you go. But I'm wondering, what was, of all the roles, which one do you find you had the most satisfaction in doing?
It's a really difficult question. I would say, on the one hand, working at CIL and working with nonprofit organizations was very exciting because we were really creating something that was new. But also then working at the national level at the Department of Education and really working hard to get the voices of disabled people and parents and others heard, and trying to have that impact the legislation and implementation and grant making, and internationally really to help people on all ends learn a lot more and begin to open doors. I think there's like a thread in everything that I've done. So I really have liked that. On the other hand, so on the one hand, I feel like important things have been happening, but as I've said earlier, it's not happening anywhere near as rapidly as it should be. And I think it's very much still because of bias that exists, people that don't identify or that are afraid of speaking up, and the need for us to hold elected representatives and government officials responsible for implementing laws, not just in the area of disability, but in the area of the environment, in the area of education for all people, on and on.
So, thank you very much, Judy, for tonight's comments and address.
Thank you very much, Jim.
The books are Being Human and Rolling Warrior. They're for sale from the Book House of Stuyvesant Plaza via a link on our website. Don't miss Crip Camp. It's it was up for an Academy Award, and it's well worth watching. Thank you so much, Judy Heumann. Thank you, Jim Odato. Thank you, audience members, for your wonderful questions. Please visit the New York State Writers Institute website for more events and programming. Be well and good night.
Thank you so much, everybody.